In 2019, President Trump put tariffs on Chinese goods. And the Xinhua news agency said publicly, our response to America's aggression is to declare people's war on the United States. Now, what does people's war mean? It is irregular warfare. It is to destroy your enemy through unconventional means before your soldiers even march. It is the 80,000 dead American kids from fentanyl in the last few months. It is stealing your technology. Ratcliffe, Trump's intelligence advisor, said the Chinese control so many American politicians now, they can determine which legislation passes your Congress and which doesn't. It is buying your farmland. It's controlling Hollywood. It's collecting your kids' information through TikTok. It is all of it. And it is, of course, biological. Now, I cannot prove that the Chinese virus was deliberately released to hurt America. It's only about 99.999% certain at this point. But it's 100% certain that once it was out there, they deliberately spread it to this country. They're 100% certain. So we got hit with the virus. Then the Chinese, working through the Communist Party USA, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and other groups, managed and extended the lockdowns as long as they could. You'll find all of the states with the worst lockdowns, all of the countries with the worst lockdowns, are the states and countries with the most communist Chinese influence. It's a pattern that's all over the world. In Britain, Boris Johnson was taking his advice from Susan Mickey of the Sage Foundation. Susan Mickey is a long-time member of the Communist Party of Britain. She's completely in China's pocket. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, former leader of the Ethiopian Maoist Communist Party, completely in China's pocket. So the Chinese gave us the virus, then they extended the lockdowns to the absolute maximum to inflict the most possible damage. So then we get hit with Black Lives Matter rioting because George Floyd was killed in Minnesota. The rioting was planned since 2016, folks. It was organised by two pro-Chinese communist parties, Liberation Road and the Freedom Road Socialist Organisation. I have on tape, they tried to start the rioting when the jogger was killed in Atlanta. It didn't work. They tried to start it again when Breonna Taylor, the young black woman, was killed in Louisville, Kentucky. Didn't work. George Floyd was the perfect spark because it was right in their headquarters in Minneapolis and it was so darn public. But if it hadn't been George Floyd, it would have been somebody else in Phoenix the week after or somebody else in Seattle the week after that. It was planned for 4 years, mass rioting in the streets. It was planned the day Trump was inaugurated. The head of Freedom Road, Steph Urick, got up in front of a meeting at an open rally in Washington, D.C. the day of his inauguration and said, our job is to bring down this president by making this country ungovernable. Freedom Road Socialist Organization burnt Minneapolis and Chicago and Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Houston and Dallas and Tampa and Tallahassee and Miami. It also burnt Salt Lake City. It burnt Phoenix, Tucson, Arizona, San Jose, East LA. The rest of it was done by the other pro-Chinese Communist Party called Liberation Road. They have a front group. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called Black Lives Matter. That's a Chinese operation, folks. 100%. And you had Republican leaders taking a knee to these people. Now, it was run, you think about it from a logical Chinese point of view. They knew that if President Trump got a second term, he would have done to the Communist Party of China what Reagan did to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But this time it would have been a lot more genuine and a lot more long-lasting. And you imagine the boon to the world we could have had with a free China. All that energy, all that creativity serving good rather than evil. That was a great opportunity lost. They had to take him down. Now, do you think, what would be more effective? If you're from a communist Chinese point of view, do you want to get into a multi-billion-dollar trade war with America, which you might lose? Do you want to get into a multi-trillion-dollar shooting war with America, you might lose? Or do you want to spend a few $1 million buying up American politicians and voting registration organizations in the United States? What would you do? So this is what happened. Black Lives Matter was basically run by a group called Asians for Black Lives. That was a front for the Chinese Progressive Association of San Francisco. That's a big voter registration organization that effectively runs San Francisco and the Bay Area. So Asians for Black Lives wrote the Black Lives Matter manual. They introduced the Black Lives Matter activists to their networks all around the country. It was a Chinese operation. And I wish you could have seen the movie, because Alex Tong of the Chinese Progressive Association and Asians for Black Lives, best friend of Alicia Garza, who started Black Lives Matter, openly boasts in this movie about his close ties to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, how he runs his messaging past them, and the biggest way to defend China is to take down President Trump. So they did Black Lives Matter. They did the lockdowns. They did the COVID. So what do you do with all of that energy? All that energy of these young, fired-up black kids who believe that Trump is a racist, Republicans are Nazis, conservatives are horrible people, Christians are just terrible. What do you do with that energy? You funnel it into voting and voter registration. Black Lives, the Chinese Progressive Association, Asians for Black Lives, set up another organization in 2019 called Seed the Vote. S-E-E-D, the Vote. And they ran voter registration organizations in the inner cities of 7 key states. Tell me if you recognize any of these states. In Arizona, they had Lucha, who knocked on 1 million doors and made 8 million phone calls in Arizona. In Wisconsin, they had black leaders organizing communities, Block, which claimed they flipped the state. In Michigan, they had Detroit Action. In Georgia, they had the New Georgia Project. In Florida, they had Florida Rising, a New Florida Majority. In Pennsylvania, they had Pennsylvania Stands Up. Are any of these states familiar to you? They claim they won 6 of the 7 states they targeted for Biden-Harris by doing mass voter registration drives in the inner cities of these states. What they really did was lifted the minority vote in these areas so that any pre-planned vote fraud would be less noticeable. But President Trump did so darn well amongst minorities that about midnight they realized it wasn't working, and then they panicked. And that's how they got sprung. Now the model for this is how it works. Anybody remember when Virginia was a really, really, really red state? And then it went really, really, really blue. And thank God for Glenn Youngkin and Winsome Sears and Moms for Liberty. Moms for Liberty won that election, people. This is what they did. And by the way, those organizations I mentioned just happen to overlap. Block and New Georgia Project and Lucha and Pennsylvania Stands Up. Some of those groups happen to overlap with the organizations that were talked about and not named in 2000 Mules. So that was the missing part of the puzzle. So I've looked at some of these organisations. Many of the organisations implicated in this were the organisations were part of this Chinese voter registration network. So there's an overlap there, a significant overlap. Well, in Virginia, they started a group in 2005, Liberation Road Communists started a group called New Virginia Majority. And they were just like Acorn, orange t-shirts. And this network has many top Acorn people in it, right? The head of Texas Organizing Project is Texas Acorn. In Florida, one of the top people in that organization is the former head of Florida Acorn. And we know that Acorn had a proven, documented history of vote fraud, do we not? Documented. People went to jail for doing it. But anyway, so in Virginia, they got out there and they signed up 300,000 minority voters in Northern Virginia. And then they worked with Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, to give pardons personally signed to 200,000 Virginia felons. And then they went and signed all those people up. That 500,000 voting base is what flipped Virginia. They put an op-ed in the New York Times in 2018 claiming credit for flipping the state. Now, the reason they were so successful, they were using GIS computerized maps, right? GIS. So they had every precinct in Virginia mapped, every one. They could tell you where the Puerto Ricans live. They could tell you where the Iranians live. They could tell you where the Ghanaians live. So they could send the right volunteers into the right neighbourhoods, maximise their vote. Now these maps were generated for the last 10 years by a Liberation Road communist called Steve McClure, a graduate of George Mason University Geography Department. And he's been making these maps, getting paid for it on contract, while working out of the Geography Department of guess where? Wuhan University, China. So you've got many Chinese connections here, folks. This network operates in North Carolina. They're the reason North Carolina has a Democrat government. It operates in Kentucky through Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, which is why Kentucky has a Democrat government. They are the reason that Georgia has 2 Democrat senators. They are the reason Arizona has 2 Democrat senators. Their stated goal is to destroy the Republican Party in the South, so you have a one-party state America. They are working on Texas and North Carolina and Georgia, Arizona, Florida and Tennessee. And if they can, well, they work in other places as well, but the main target is the South. Mandela Barnes, who's standing for the Senate in Wisconsin, is part of this network. Kamala Harris is a big part of this network. So their goal is to destroy the GOP in the South by mobilising millions of people of colour in the South and running candidates, left-wing candidates of colour, like Stacey Abrams, like Andrew Gillum, for instance, like Barack Obama. He was one of their protégés as well. So this is the Rainbow Coalition of the 80s run all over again. You get all the minorities together with the progressive whites and you have a majority. Then you do mass voter registration in the inner city communities of the key swing states, and no doubt lots and lots of vote fraud. I can't testify to vote fraud. All I can testify is that these networks are deeply linked to Communist China, and their publications explicitly state that their goal is to destroy the GOP as a permanent force in this country, to bring about a permanent progressive America, which will be completely controlled by Communist China. Now, just to add to some of Jeff's points, now, one thing that really divides our movement right now is Russia and Ukraine. We've got some who think Putin is just wonderful, some who think he's the worst man on earth. I just say this, Vladimir Putin organized a conference in 2017 in Sochi, Russia. And he got 30,000 young kids from all over the world. It's called the World Festival for Youth and Students. Go and Google it. He was the keynote speaker. He told these young kids, the future is yours, go for it. These were 30,000 young communists from all over the world, including right here. The theme of the conference was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Folks, Vladimir Putin is working with Xi Jinping to permanently alter the world balance of power. That's why Biden gave Afghanistan to China. That's why Biden said, Putin, you can invade Ukraine, that's all right, we won't do anything. That is why nothing is going to happen when the Chinese block Taiwan into submission, because Biden is part of the operation. He has worked with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians since 1972. Why did they need to win the election? Because they knew that Trump would screw up their plans. Why has the world turned to chaos since the election, folks? Why are the bad guys on the march everywhere you look, including in this country? Because their opposition had gone. They got the man in the White House they wanted. They could change the world balance of power forever. We've got to understand vote fraud in the context of a major international power play to destroy this country as a power. This is Saul Alinsky. This is Mao. This is Lenin. This is Gramsci. But it's directed by right now out of Venezuela, out of Iran, out of Russia, out of China, right now. And just what Jeff said about the border. People say, well, we shouldn't be worried about Ukraine because we've got to guard our own border. People, it's the same communists who are attacking our border that are attacking their border. AMLO, the president of Mexico, is a member of the Sao Paulo Forum, set up by Fidel Castro to spread communism all through Latin America. Just here's something to think about. Venezuela used to have 30 million people, right? Most prosperous country in Latin America. A few years of socialism, 20% of the population left the country. 20%. While Mexico's got 130 million people. The Liberation Road communists who are behind Black Lives Matter and these voter registration organizations are working with Morena, the political party now running Mexico, to keep the borders wide open. AMLO is going to collapse the Mexican economy. He's going to go full on Venezuela and Mexico. He is doing it right now. And when their economy crashes, where are 20% of 130 million people going to go, folks? Where our military is not ready to fight a one-front war, let alone a two-front war, but within a year we could be fighting on the border, within America with the people the Spetsnaz and the Chinese military operatives and the Hamas and Hezbollah already here, plus we could be fighting the Iranians in the Middle East, plus the Russians in Europe, plus the Chinese and the North Koreans. We have to understand this is not just about America. This is an international power play to bring down the Constitution, bring down American Christianity. And look, please, if you're worried about Christianity, I'm not trying to do a plug here. You've got to see enemies within the church. That is all about the Marxist infiltration of a massive scale of American Christianity. You wonder why the churches don't stand up? You wonder what the woke church is? It's Marxist, and that's one of our last lines of defense. But so we got to understand, the vote fraud had an international strategic purpose. There's a lot of countries had a big interest in getting rid of President Trump and installing somebody much more compliant like Joe Biden. This is way beyond America. So we've got to factor that into our activism, factor that into our equations. We've got to look at the strategic implications of what Russia's doing and China and what's happening on the border. All of it is interrelated. The number one target is us. What is the major impediment to a world socialist state? What is the only impediment to a world socialist state right now? It is us. And we have got somebody in the White House who's been working for them for 40 years. Why would you not make your move now? So what do? Well, election integrity is super important, because if you don't have election integrity and you don't have confidence in your elections, the next step is people taking up arms. And some people think that might be a good idea in America. But what they never factor in is this. If this country dissolved into a civil war, what would Russia do? What would China do? What would Iran do? And Mexico and Venezuela and Cuba? They'd sit it all out, right? They'd just wait till we sorted it out and rebuilt, right? They would take advantage of that situation. The only way we save America is to keep America together. It's the only way. And that means building alliances with people we may not once build alliances with. People like Naomi Klein, who's a leftist, but now through the COVID has started to see the danger this country's in. I go around this country, folks, and I'm meeting groups everywhere. The Moms for Liberty groups, the Christian groups, the Patriot groups are rising up everywhere. The COVID did us at least one favour. You got 100 million people sitting at home reading their kids' school textbooks in horror, going on their kids' Zoom sessions in horror, watching their cities burn in horror, watching their elections stolen, their economy wrecked, and they're finally woken up to the fact that yes, we could lose this country. And what happens, people? Why do the greatest victories come from the darkest times? Because in the darkest times, that's when good people finally get off the darn fence and start looking out for what they should be doing all along.